This is ABC Radio Brisbane with Steve Austin.
5:16. So you've just heard how high the housing supply remains. Now there are millions of dollars worth of work in the pipeline for government-supplied social and affordable housing that won't translate into bricks and mortar for years. So who's doing the heavy lifting in this? My next guest says mum and dad investors, and they need further encouragement. James Fitzgerald is a property expert and managing director of Custodian. Just explain what you do at Custodian, if you would please, James, first of all.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, for having me. We help Australians, mum and dad investors, build property portfolios, long and short. And I reckon they're the scapegoat, the unlucky scapegoat, and whipping boy and girl for, affordability, housing crisis. They're the easy go-to to be made out as the scapegoat. Well, that's how you've been painted, money-grubbing landlords, Scrooge McDucks, sort of sitting in the corner working out how you can do over the poor when you rent out an apartment to them. Why is it that politicians attack negative gearing? Who are they having a go at for you, James Fitzgerald? Well, I think there's a big misconception that property investors, mum and dad investors, they're all wealthy baby boomers, when couldn't be further from the truth. 2/3 of property investors earn less than $100,000 a year as an income, which is not far above the average wage, and 50% of them are under the age of 50. Our most common property investors are nurses, teachers, public servants, accountants, electricians. They're everyday people. So they're not people who own 20, 30, 40 dwellings and they're finding ways of, of leveraging for their share portfolio as they go ski at Whistler or somewhere else overseas. No, definitely not. I mean, and in fact, there's nearly 1/3 of Australians live in a rental property that's owned by a mum and dad investor, and 90% of them only own one. So you think they should be encouraged, not discouraged, from investing more? Yeah, I mean, the housing crisis is a big issue, big talking point, and it was very prevalent in the budget. We're going to bring in, grow by 1.3 million people, bring in one whole Adelaide in the next 3 years. We're going to be 100,000 houses short. And I guess the only thing that dealt with that in the budget was we're going to encourage foreign companies to come in and build a bunch of apartments and rent them out. So, whereas we've got all these mum and dad investors who've been doing the heavy lifting, and we haven't offered them an incentive. So what should the government be considering by way of policy at a state and federal level to encourage these people, you say, who are on about 100,000 a year, bit over, to invest in housing in Australia? What should government policy do? So in Australia, you're allowed to negatively gear, and that involves a big way you do that is you depreciate the house by roughly 2.5% per annum. What the government has done in the most recent budget is they're going to allow these foreign companies, if they do build for rent, to depreciate at a rate of 4%. Why not match that and offer it to the mum and dad investors? That'd be a starting point. So I heard the build to rent stuff in the budget. So what this means was that foreign construction companies will be allowed to come into Australia and depreciate their properties by double what they allow local mum and dad investors to do. Yes, and they'll halve their withholding tax, which, I don't know what that amounts to, but that could probably be funneled into some rates, land tax, stamp duty savings, somewhere along the lines. They're state taxes versus federal, but I'm sure there's a way of doing it. So the federal plan is to favour overseas companies, not Australian citizens, to invest in housing. Yeah. And I think negative gearing is one of the greatest political and social inventions of all time. And I know that might make me unpopular, but I wrote a whole book on it. It's mum and dad investors literally providing housing for the Australians that need it most, the affordable housing, at the same time building their wealth so they don't rely on the pension. Well, you can put me in the camp of one of the people who complained about negative gearing, because I think, you guys are freeloading off the tax base. Basically, you're eroding the tax base of Australians, and it should come to an end because those filthy money-grubbing landlords are taking all the money and abusing it. Well, maybe, Steve, I'll give you something to consider. I'm not going to say you're right, I'm wrong, but property investors get refunded about $100 million a year in tax refunds. The welfare system costs Australia $220 billion. What costs more? Well,
Well, the welfare system.
Well, yeah.
But the welfare system is a statement of our values, that we care about pensioners, we care about the disabled, we care about the unemployed, we care about the needy, so it's a value statement either way.
Oh, and look, if it was just high-income earners that were using negative gearing and investing, I hear you, but they're our teachers, our nurses. You've already spoken in this program about how hard the teachers and nurses have had to work, lately. Why not offer them an opportunity to provide the affordable housing that we need, and at the same time build their wealth so that they don't need to rely on the government for a pension?
My guest is James Fitzgerald. He's a property expert and managing director of Custodian. This is ABC Radio Brisbane. Steve Voss, my name. I was talking about this with someone recently. A while back, people were being advised, both by politicians and by private investors, to plan for their financial future, to build their nest egg. And this is quite responsible. Of course you should be planning for the future. Of course you should be planning for your nest egg. And there were two ways that ordinary mum and dad investors tended to do this. A lot of people sort of play the stock market, but they're really playing. The two big ways were negative gear a property, which was sort of like a superannuation for when you retire, and buy a taxi licence. The people who saw a taxi licence as their superannuation plan, they got done over by the state government a few years back when rideshare came, and they are hurt. I mean, they were really hurt. And they were working class people who really got burnt by buying a taxi licence. What you're telling me is that the pressure is now on mum and dad investors who have an investment property as a superannuation or investment strategy for their retirement, and the pressure is to try and burn them as well.
Well, the reality is that the pension is only $27,000 a year. It's not a lot of money, and it's great that we probably have one of the best pensions in the developed world. But it isn't a lot of money, and the reality is that for most Australians, they are going to need more than that to be comfortable. So they do have to take matters into their own hands.
Yeah, okay. So what else could state or federal governments be doing to encourage people to invest in housing so that we have more supply? Everyone agrees that the problem is supply. So from your perspective, what should be done to encourage that?
Well, the solution to supply and affordability is density at the end of the day, and we've got a really complex system in Australia where we've got three tiers of government. They don't always see eye to eye. They don't always have the same incentives. Like the federal government is incentivised to bring in migrants and collect the taxes, whereas the state government, they're the ones who have to ultimately foot the bill for the infrastructure. So they've got to get in a room, I guess, and find out a way to make it really easy in and around critical infrastructure that's already there. Train stations, for example, unlimited height. 400 square metre block, you should just be, as of right, able to subdivide it into a 200 square metre block. 200 square metres is very comfortable. We've seen a lot of terraced housing. That's how housing started in Australia. It can be done. We've just got to make it a little bit easier to do it on scale. And unfortunately, the build-to-rent stuff, that's a Band-Aid solution. The fastest solution is to work with the 10 million dwellings we've already got, make it really easy to put more density into those.
For some reason I missed this. I didn't realise that the build-to-rent plan basically meant that international companies would come in, and so they're given a 4%, what was the phrase you used, a 4%, not a depreciation or property devaluation, or write-off? 4%.
So you can depreciate the value of any improvements to the building at 2.5% per annum. That's what you're allowed to do.
If you're an Australian mum and dad investor, but it's going to be 4% if you're an international company.
Yes.
Crikey.
Well, and any company that does build to rent, the super funds, or whoever chooses to do it, I just don't quite understand why you don't try and put a wider net to that to mum and dad investors.
Drew at Annerley says, I have a different view. We have mum and dad investors who brought the house over the back fence. It's part of their family trust self-managed super fund. Since they bought it 3 years ago, they've made $500,000 capital gains. The tenant are the university student children, making money, housing their children, and not actually contributing to the supply pool, says Drew. Any thoughts?
Oh, I don't know his neighbours, but...
Fair enough, yeah. Sounds like they're pretty smart investors to me.
Yeah, well, look, what I would say is that, it's got to be done in the right way. And again, I don't know his neighbours, but the reality is 2/3 of people who own investment properties earn less than $100,000. So it might sound like it's just wealthy people, but the facts are the facts. 2/3 of them earn the average wage, and half of them are under the age of 50. So, there might be the odd outlier, I'm sure, like Drew's neighbour, but, for the vast majority, they're just hard-working, everyday Australians.
Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Steve.